And welcome to Talking Cannabis. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Kenny.
Good morning. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Tom and Etienne and Ryan and Sam. And we're also going to have Mel Frank on with us in a little while as soon as he restarts his computer. And how are you all doing today?
Great.
Wonderful.
Before we went on live, Ryan, you were talking about testing in Canada and why you think it should be more mandatory than it already is. Would you like to elaborate?
We have a dual system in Canada now that we've got a corporate production model that's slipping in, and all those suppliers and growers are required to go a whole battery of tests to ensure that their flowers pass muster before they're on the market. But we also have this kind of gray market dispensary set up where some cities have allowed dispensaries to exist because, well, you know, they can't squash them. It's like Sam says, it's the whack-a-mole model where, you know, the police come down on one and two pop up in its place. But that whole market, that whole dispensary market is cut off from the testing world, whether it's a financial burden or whatever it is. A lot of the medicine isn't tested. So it's becoming a real issue. You know, this dichotomy of one system that has this really stringent set of controls and the other system where, you know, we're finding contaminated flowers on the market.
That's the real problem. I mean, you know, it's still startling that we're in a somewhat legal market for almost 2 decades in California, and companies are still finding over 80% failure rates in the products they're testing. And that's failing for mold, that's failing for pesticide use. You know, what are some of the, you know, what should consumers be looking for when or worried about in their contaminating their cannabis?
Well, I think part of the problem is that over prohibition over the last 30, 40 years, we've kind of learned that, you know, if you can get anything, then hey, you can get high, you can get your meds, right? And so we haven't been very discerning as consumers. But you know, people like Etienne's group, the Berkeley Patients Group in Berkeley, have created a system or put forth a system that the city has adopted, in which no flowers can be sold through dispensaries, or no cannabis products can be sold on the shelves of dispensaries without being tested first. And right. It's a model where the feedstock, all the products that come on the shelves, they're from member patient cultivators, right? It's like, this is not corporations that are producing the flowers. It's it could be anybody. But the linchpin that allows things on the market is the quality control. So I think Berkeley really is a shining example that you can have a system that's not run by big corporations that are regulated by an entity, or instead the growers and dispensaries essentially come together to self-regulate to ensure that healthy products are put on the marketplace.
It was very tricky, and it's not easy to do. And I don't envy the challenge that you have, because it was more of a challenge than I ever realized. Sorry, the cat just jumped. But it was very much a frustration, and it's a frustration I kind of still feel, is that once we tested everything, the next thing we know, everybody else is taking their products elsewhere and not actually dealing with us. And of course, it costs money. It's very expensive to test, and it's also very difficult when you had no litmus to actually test by. We had to actually find people from around the world and bring in and get them into laboratories under the threat of $10,000 a fine per test. And even after we got our testing up and started satellite testing and ring testing with other laboratories, it was very few and far between. It was only the largest. Us and Harborside were really the only ones that really started to deal with testing. And it took years before the city of Berkeley actually adopted it, and it took even more years before the state of California has now adopted it, so that everything will be tested before it hits the floor. But it's been very long, frustrating, dogged persistence, and using multiple laboratories. I lost a laboratory along the way because of fear from those that own the machinery that the government would come in and seize their equipment because of the reality of the fear of testing as well as prohibition.
So can I ask you the logistics? Who pays the cost of the testing? Is it the dispensary? Is it the grower? Is it split between the two? How do you decide what is a batch size? I mean, obviously, if a grower is selling 1 pound to a dispensary, and then the grower is required to pay the testing fees associated with that 1 pound, the total testing fees amortized over the cost of 1 pound, or the revenue from 1 pound. It's a big expense. Oh, yeah. So how does that whole thing get justified?
You eat it. That's the reality. It gets passed on slightly to the consumer, but you can't charge the consumer that entire reality. So you have to eat that margin. That's the reality. Because testing is expensive, and when you start testing, it's very expensive, and it isn't until you actually get the laboratories up and going that you can then start to talk to them about doing batch discounts and things like that, because everything that I have that comes through the door is tested, and everything that comes through our door, we only accept about 80% of it just off our organoleptic viewpoints, and then we send it off to testing. So I will give a discount to a patient cultivar if they come in with a test from a laboratory that we deal with beforehand. That saves me the trouble from having to actually run that batch, as long as that batch is what it is. I don't want somebody coming in with the same batch and the same test every single time, which unfortunately I know a lot of people do, or over in the Netherlands and other countries. I know that's the reality, is that people can't afford to test each batch, but we do, and it is expensive, and that's the reality. And people are like, oh, well, your cannabis is expensive. Yes, it is. I have 85 employees in a retail location and have to pay insurance. On top of that, I have to pay for this testing. And those are the realities of, running a business. Even though we act as a not-for-profit, the reality of testing is it's a steep expense for the individual farmer, and so we work with the farmer when dealing with something like that. But we as a dispensary have realized that we can make the money right now, and we can afford to spend that on this type of reality so that our patients get the benefit of it. For us, it's more of a moral obligation to do what is right, because I don't want, and I have enough issues of what I did in war on my conscience. I don't want another dead person on my conscience. So as long as I can test and make sure that what I have is safe and clean for patients, that I can sleep well at night. That expense doesn't matter to me, but I am as rare gets in reality of people who have that moral obligation. I've watched people around me go off and sell the stuff that fails to all those around me who don't test or do the proper things. Berkeley only has 3 dispensaries. So only 3 dispensaries in Berkeley test. The other people that I know that do testing only test for potency. They don't test for pesticides and herbicides like we do. So again, it's buyer beware, caveat emptor. Unless you come to Berkeley, and soon the state of California will adopt it so that everybody will have to go through this. I will no longer be blackballed by companies because they fail testing. The state will blackball them, and I'm okay with that.
Well, isn't that also something that's going to change too, because of the fact there is 3 clubs in Berkeley? There's a little bit more profit margins when there's a lot more customers. So when this gets spread out more evenly, and businesses are seeing more nominal numbers coming through their door because there's so much healthy competition, this is going to have to be mandated by the state, because there won't be globs of extra profit margin, if you will, and people will be looking to cut corners everywhere they can. And I think that it's a good thing if the state actually gets involved and makes sure that the cannabis people are consuming are not soaked in pesticides or growth hormones, or potency and terpene levels are great. They're interesting. They're somewhat informative, not really some ways, but realistically, what we should be demanding is that our cannabis is clean, mold-free, pesticide-free, and free of growth hormones. I mean, above all, I like the numbers though when I see, you know, THC and stuff, but.
Well, for THC, it's not, I mean, you know, whether you're smoking a 10% flower or 20% flower is a little bit bravado and a little bit ego and a little bit how high am I going to get? And so to that type of consumer, it's not a big deal. But if you're, you know, if you're looking for a pure CBD variety or a type 2 mixed CBD THC variety because your child has a specific illness, then yeah, measurements are incredibly important because, you know, you don't want to be dosing your kid up with a bunch of THC and sending them off to school.
Same thing with terpenes. Terpenes are a total of 3% or 5% or 10%. I think it'd be nice to know.
And as we learn to interpret the numbers, I think consumers will be wiser having them for sure, because, like, you know, especially if you're someone that's trying to consume an edible that you want it to be THCA and not really get you high, and you're not looking to, you know, to consume a decarboxylated molecule, it's really useful information to be able to see what form of THC is in the edible before you consume it, so you can gauge if you're going to be, you know, able to function or not. So I think it's really important information on every level, but let's start with clean.
Well, that's all we wanted to do, is start with clean, and we had to go through, like I said, it was quite a march just to get to that. But we're here now. It's 10 years down the line. Everybody is testing now. We've got laboratories all over the state of California now. We've got legal laboratories in almost all of the legal states and working on it toward the medical states. So the catalyst of change is there. It's just now we have to embolden our municipalities, our states, our state governments to understand why we've been doing this and hold everybody to the same standards.
Etienne, did you see the recent paper by Kevin McKernan where he's talking about cannabis plants producing promethians?
Yes, we were talking about that last week, and I look forward to seeing more of that study, because microbutanol is one of the main reasons that things fail, but also pyrethrins are also another reason. So it's going to be interesting to see if they are encapsulated inside of the trichomes or if they're from any other part of the plant, because I think Rand asked earlier, what should be the proper batch size for testing and transportation costs? They're different wherever you are. But batch size, if I usually get, is about 1 pound, and we take a representative sample, which is usually 2 grams, because each gram is tested separate. So I usually send off a double, because if something fails, I want them to immediately run that second to make sure that was a fail or not. But if there are pyrethrins growing inside the plant, or the plant is producing them, we need to know what those plants are and what those genetics are, so that science can, we need to study that. I mean, that's a whole new level of misunderstanding that we would have had regarding this plant and what it's producing.
I'm hoping it's not true, because you would have thought that with all the testing done by different world organizations, they would have found this, and it hasn't been reported.
Well,
yeah,
but
Adrian DeWitt Lee appeared on Church last week, and he actually was very cautious about presenting that data. I think we should make it clear that that paper that was presented, it wasn't peer reviewed. It was published on what they call a preprint server. And the idea of publishing preprint is that you can make the data available to other researchers and commenters that can read it and actually critique the research.
And try to duplicate the work also.
Yeah. So there's been actually a fair amount of critique on various platforms about that discovery, and there's been some suggestion that the molecule that was tentatively identified as pyrethrin is actually a different terpenoid that's actually not pyrethrin. So there is a certain amount of people calling that research into question.
Well, that's what we need, science, right? This is what we want, peer review. We want to understand this together, not separately.
Well, again, testing is not about, it's not to show that you have the highest numbers. testing is to show that you have accurate numbers, right? Testing is really about what's in the flower, or in the oil of the edible or whatever. But it's really important that you don't, we have some of these markets like in Washington. I've heard dispensary owners and even growers, they call cannabinoid profiles, they call them THC scores. Well, it's not a score, right? It's not. There's nothing cool about having the highest number. And again, I've said this before, but when you go in to buy a nice bottle of wine at a liquor store, you don't go in and ask what's the highest alcohol content, right? It's not what it's about. So there's more to the experience than a high number. And I think the advent of testing has brought around this culture where everybody's trying to get the highest number.
Well, this was the big problem we had when Harborside was the first to put out testing on their product. And what they did was they just put the THC out there. And then that had a large ripple effect on the market. I'm just giving you what happened here in California, just as an example. Oh, there's Jim. And the reality was very frustrating because farmers that had product that had been selling no problem at this particular price point, now because their THC content wasn't as high as an expectation, that they received less money for their product. Some were just outright, after being regular vendors for, I know for many years, they were then just kicked to the curb because their numbers didn't read high in the THC that people were looking for. It seemed to be a sort of a alcohol mentality for whiskey, that the higher proof seemed to be the predominant reality. But we did not present the public with the actual reality of the information.
The growers should have just changed labs. They could have found another lab that gave them twice the numbers with the exact same herb.
Well, this is in fact exactly what's happened in Washington State. There's, they did a study and looked at the cumulative results from different laboratories and averaged them out. And there was one specific laboratory that was testing consistently about 5% higher than the average of everybody else. So it's an intentional miscalibration of your equipment so that the numbers come out higher. So when a grower sends you a flower and they send the same flower to a different laboratory, your numbers come back higher, and therefore they can put that high number on their packaging, which makes them sell more flowers to the dispensary, right? But again, it's a real disservice to the whole concept of testing, because again, testing should be about accurate numbers that represent exactly what's in the flower, not the highest number.
But every lab should basically be able to reproduce pretty much the same result if they're using identical methods.
Well, that was the problem we had as well. One of the laboratories around here decided to go proprietary with their information and not share their actual methodologies. And that became an issue then that other laboratories took hold of and said, hey, wait, science is science. We should all be able to replicate. Making this proprietary does nothing but give you a corner of a market. And so we saw other laboratories pop up and, fight against that type of exclusionary thinking.
So why don't you explain what a ring test is so that people can understand how we check laboratories and how in a given market we can keep them honest and accurate?
Well, we have we'll say a haze, and we have this haze as we know it is we'll say a 20%. Okay. So then we will send that sample to the labs that we deal with, which currently I deal with 3 labs, but I'm also testing out another 2 labs. So we'll send a couple of grams of one particular product that we know is this particular number. And then we will send it out to other laboratories. Those laboratories will run that test. If that test does not come back the number that we expect it to be, then we know that they have an issue with their calibration or their testing. And so that's what we do. It's a way of keeping laboratories honest, and it's also a way for us to know that the laboratories are doing something proper from the beginning. Because some laboratories won't.
That must be a bit hard, Etienne, because I know some labs use HPLC-MS. Some people are using GCFID. Some people are using other methodologies. So, I mean, as long as the methodology is identical, then the results should be pretty similar. But yeah, they're using a lot of different methodologies out there.
But even with different methodologies, there's something called validation. So when a lab decides to use a given methodology, or they invent a methodology to do their testing, they have to do what's called or they're supposed to do what's called a validation step. And that essentially is, does our method measure what we say it measures? Right. So really, it doesn't matter.
You have to do a bunch of them, and it has to be reproducible within a certain narrow range.
Yeah. So it really, actually, the methodology shouldn't impact the result. All the results should be the same, right? If it's a validated method. So GC has now been kind of pushed out of the circle of a validated methodology, because up to 30% of the THC acid is destroyed in the injector port of the gas chromatograph.
Right. Correct, but that was the early. Most people, that was all they had, was the.
That's right.
So it wasn't until I found this laboratory that did secondary testing for Novartis and Bayer that I found UV HPLCs, etc.
Right.
There's one advantage to a GC-FID, and that is if you want to look at what a person would get if they were smoking it.
And that was beneficial, and that's what we wanted.
Again, I don't think that
initially that's what we thought what we wanted.
Yeah, I don't know if that's necessarily true. I mean, I think that's a supposition that we make. Listen, there's a lot of reasons that you'd use GCFID. Arno's group, for example, does a single run where you can do, with one injection, you can get both cannabinoid and terpene profiles. But I think the reality is the cannabinoid profile is not as accurate as it would be if it was done on an HPLC piece of equipment.
Correct.
However, from a breeding perspective, like you and I are doing, Sam, it's you can use a GC, because if we're looking for in a population of plants,
I know we did use a GC. We first used HPLC, and then we more and more just use GCFID.
Yeah, well, like I'm saying,
for terpenes, it's better. For cannabinoids, it's not quite as accurate, but it sure is. Wham bam, thank you, ma'am. Run 26 samples overnight.
Yeah, I think saying it's not quite as accurate is, again, being probably a little generous. I mean, like I said, you can lose up to 30% of the cannabinoids in the injector, so that's a pretty big loss. And like I was saying, if you're screening 100 plants or 50 plants or whatever, and you're just trying to figure out which one is the highest producing cannabinoid plant, then the GC is fine. But if you're using it to delineate and demarcate what is in this flower, you're essentially putting the contents on the flower that it's actually not a sufficient method. And that's why everybody has switched to the HPLC or the UPLC.
Can I clarify something, Ryan, that you said? You don't lose 30%, but it decarboxylates 30% of the THCA, correct?
No, it's actually, it can be up to 30% of the THC can be destroyed in the injector.
Destroyed, so lost and not in the test.
Yeah, it's not measured.
Never found.
Not measured. Not decarboxylated.
In the same way that you lose 25% if you smoke it in a joint.
We figured.
Well, we don't know that. I mean,
we did GC versus the HPL, so we did see ranges of loss anywhere from 20 to 25%, if I remember. So it could be closer to the 30. Easy.
I can't even get my last question.
Go ahead, ask.
Go ahead, Kenny.
Destroyed, does that mean it's converted to CBN? Is it showing up as some other compound? I mean, for every give there's a take, or every take there's a give.
I think it's actually destroyed, Kenny, but maybe I'm wrong in it. But I don't think it's converted to something else.
Well, it doesn't just magically disappear, right?
Yeah, no, it can. It can be broken up into a whole series of other I mean, you got THC is a relatively complex molecule, right? It's got a lot of carbons and hydrogens. So if the right amount of energy is applied to that molecule, it can essentially shatter, like think of like a spaceship in Star Wars. When it gets hit by a laser beam, the thing blows up into a bunch of different pieces. So our test might not detect all those little pieces, but it's sure not detecting the spaceship anymore.
Yeah, but the particulate matter still has content, so to speak, mineral content or something, so to speak.
It's blown apart into its ionic components, but those aren't typically measured in a GC unless you're using an MS.
Sure.
Right.
Exactly.
Can I pause you guys for a minute? Can you hear us, Jim? Okay, Jim's been having technical difficulties, but he's been really trying in earnest to get on. So I just wanted to see if we had sound with him. But go ahead, guys. Sorry to interrupt.
So for Etienne and Ryan, I got a question. I hear these oblique figures of 62 and 84% of the cannabis failed in Washington State and California, but I've never seen a pie chart. I've never seen a breakdown of how much is insecticide, how much is fungicide, how much is, pollutant or whatever. Have you ever seen a breakdown this way?
I actually have. SC Labs did a great study on this. So
yeah, I mean that's a very relevant figure to figure out. What are we targeting here? Is the majority of it powdery mildew? So it's microbutanol application, or is it? What is the main culprit? What's number 2, 3, 4?
It depends. Like for concentrates, the number 1 fail is microbutanol right now.
Gotcha.
For concentrates. For a water hash, of course, it's still molds. Flowers, it's still white powdery mildews, and other pesticides are still key things. And one of the reality is when you send something off to testing, the microbials take 72 hours minimum.
Sure.
Okay, and so people have to realize, they think I'm going to turn around and get this test back, etc. But I mean, you can speed that up, but that you have to go buy the type of equipment that is in a hospital and do the 24-hour culture stuff. And in the future, that will be available. Somebody's going to have the money to go off and buy that, but currently, no way, shape, or form. Okay, let's pull up Ryan's got some data here.
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm curious about. They release these oblique figures, but they never ever give a breakdown of this percent this percent that, this percent this.
No, I should do a compilation. We have, it's just each test we get a pass fail, and then we can break it all down as it comes to us from CW.
So what are we looking at there, Ryan?
So we know that SC Labs has been doing testing on well, they do market testing, so they aggregate their data across the market, but they also do the testing for the Emerald Cup. So, when they do these tests and these screen for the Emerald Cup, also they collect all the data. So here's a breakdown, and I can't actually remember if this is. Oh, you can see. So on the bottom, there's a legend that shows, the green bar is October, this gray is January, orange is February, this other kind of greeny gray is March, and then there's the Emerald Cup results. And so you can see the percentage across this whole series of different compounds. We've got imidacloprid here. Spiromethicin is is it fluoramide? Or Avid, it's one of the two. I think bivensate is actually fluoramide. And myclobutanil is here. So you can see, you can actually see looking at the graph, I mean, green is October. So in October, obviously, it's starting to get wet in some places in California.
Yeah, the rain's coming late September, early October.
Yeah, and these are also expressed as a percentage. It's not a total number score. So, but you can see that in that time, there's probably much higher levels of powdery mildew growing on plants, and then growers start using myclobutanil more.
So does this 40% of this, does this express that 40% of the tested cannabis came back contaminated?
Yeah, 40% of the samples that came into their lab in that time period. Oh my
heavens, that's just incredible.
I mean, so I consider that a very valuable piece of data rather than just an oblique figure to have the actual breakdown. I mean, look, there it is in a graph. That's very informative and interesting to me. I mean, that means for any new large scale growers going out there to produce in a greenhouse, they know what their number one problem is going to be, and that's humidity control and environmental control, so they can prevent powdery mildew, obviously.
Yeah, what hasn't happened yet is the market hasn't circled back because the value of cannabis on the market is driven so much by organoleptic properties. We end up with these situations, for example, where LA is really hungry for OG, right? The Bay Area is really hungry for cookies. So the smell and the organoleptic properties become the driver of cost of flowers on the market, and also of value to the growers. Right, so something like, for example, maybe like a Jack Herer or a Trainwreck wouldn't be as popular amongst growers because they're only going to get, you know, say 75% of the value of if they were growing an OG. But the impact is that there's, you know, Trainwreck is a little bit more of a powdery mildew resistant variety than OG. OG is quite susceptible. OG and the cookies and that whole family are quite susceptible. But because growers grow for the market based on flavor profile, they're highly incentivized to do it because they're going to get, you know, 30% more dollar value for their flowers out the door.
Yeah, but there'd be a big shift in market if we just grew for pest and disease resistance. You know what I mean? We'd end up in a whole different corner, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And so if you're growing for, like, for example, if you're making, you know, if you're growing a ton of OG and then you're taking it and you're stripping out the terpenes and distilling the oil product so that you have a flavorless THC extract that you can put into edibles, then who cares what the flavor profile of the plant was that was growing?
Oh, for sure.
It doesn't need to come from an OG if you're not going to try to preserve that OG flavor.
100%. It's about the targeted
those growers
compound.
might be more willing to grow something that's a little more powdery mildew resistant.
Yeah, no, you obviously, as a commercial option, you grow whatever is high in the targeted chemical you're looking to produce, right?
Well, it's a trade-off. You want to grow that highest in that chemical that you're trying to produce, but also that also has the endogenous level of resistance,
geographic resistance, whatever.
Right, like a 32% THC acid OG that you're going to grow on, say, 10 hectares. If the whole thing is going to get powdery mildew and you got to spray it,
yeah,
it makes more sense to plant something that's like a 20% or 25% THC acid producing plant that has a resistant genetic background. So it's funny because, again, we come back to the situation where, wow, we've come so far and look at all the things we know, but still our practices are governed by this prohibition era. Like, we haven't really moved into the future.
Yeah, but what I find interesting about the data is I also subscribe to a magazine called Greenhouse Management, and they put out reports like this, like, what was the #1 problem in the industry last year? And it's funny, the problems that are in this industry are the same problems they deal with, which is even more fascinating. And, how do they deal with these issues, et cetera? So whether it's, aphids or powdery mildew or whitefly or this, that, and the other thing, I mean, it rises and falls based on geographic location and weather conditions and everything else. But it's very interesting to see the correlation. But since we are headed towards the world of big ag, people should pay attention to how legitimate, organic, large-scale farmers deal with their crops.
Right.
Well, and have been dealing with them, right? I mean, you've educated me greatly just looking at the tomato market and what they've done. And because, again, we used to, you go into your hydroponic store 20 years ago, you talked about your tomatoes. But there was a reason, because tomatoes have a certain correlation with cannabis, biologically, as well as through growth cycles, et cetera. So it was easy to talk about that. However, the reality is the tomato farming industry has been dealing with these issues for decades, and there's less than a handful that have been doing it for decades and doing it right. But they're the predominant dominators of the market today.
Yeah, well, I mean, even in I'm not sure if it was Montana or Ohio, but there's a huge level of, there's a huge industry for people growing mint for extract for essences. And they were actually getting a bunch of feedback from the consumer groups that the levels of some of these, these crop protection chemicals in the mint extracts and the essential oil extracts was getting to be ridiculous. So there's a whole bunch of pushback on the growers that they needed to change their practices and stop spraying these agrochemicals on the plants because, again, it was contaminating the final product. And so there's a big push for them, and they've actually gone back and retooled their processes, and now there's a huge degree of beneficial insects being planted on the crops from an early age, right? They use can't even remember the name of it. I'm having a brain fart here, but they use a special mite that lives longer, and it actually colonizes to the area. And so they found that by putting huge numbers of these predator mites on the fields, that they're able to suppress the two-spotted mite population over a few years. And that stops them from having to spray these chemicals. Right. So it's like
cannabis is becoming a real crop. It's becoming welcomed into the world of real agriculture, and it's going to start facing the same kinds of problems that we
when
face.
it's grown by the acre, then we will have to help it grow without problems.
Yeah, consumers are going to demand it. And really, when you think about the oil extract from these mint plants, I mean, that's the same thing that we're going through with the oil extracts from cannabis. You know, there's no denying that oil products and vape extracts from cannabis flowers is probably at this point in time the dominant use of cannabis. You know, there's probably more people smoking vaping extracts or dabbing extracts or eating edibles than there are people smoking flowers.
Predominantly, I would in California, I would disagree. It's growing exponentially, but I'd still say 70% is still flowers. But it's growing, and in other markets where I've traveled and seeing pre-rolls, edibles, and concentrates tend to be the predominant grower in the market. The largest growing market right now is like, I think, the $40, the mid-range dabbable concentrates, be it distillate or BHO, etc.
Right, and even in through distilling, because the cannabinoids have similar chemical properties to a lot of these pesticides, it's hard to clean up these extracts and having them be completely free from pesticides. Right, and it's the inevitable dirty secret that nobody wants to admit.
Well, that's what
there is a ton of there's a ton of contamination of our flowers in the market, and that's what I meant when we've become complacent as consumers over the last 30, 40 years. Is that the fact that you could actually, I remember a time where it'd be like you go to try to get herb for the weekend, and you'd go and you'd be satisfied that you got flowers, right? That's what you got, right? You got what was available. And there was no thought given to the bioburden or the amount of the mold or chemicals that are on the plant, right? You just didn't even think about it.
Or choice for that matter.
To get it.
Yeah.
Right? That was the joy of it, finding the connection. There was no question. There was just a thank you.
Yeah, exactly. And then you were set, to go off to enjoy your weekend, knowing that you had your stash.
Kids, every Mexican national that was smuggling and growing marijuana was honorable. None of them would ever spray anything, except for maybe Coca-Cola or a few tennis shoes in the kilo or some Spanish National Geographics in the kilos.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I found nails and screws in your product because people are putting in those 7-gram nails so that they could, that little bit of money that they were making. And we've also seen it. I don't know if you guys have seen the sprays that about 10 years ago, there was these
flavor sprays.
No, they were worse than that. They were it looked like green oil, and it had these tiny little glass balls. And this is a problem that was more apparent in Holland and England, but people would create this little this concoction of green oil and little tiny glass balls that were about the size of resin heads, and they'd coat the herb with it, and it would make it look shiny. It would make it look like herb. It would make it look like highly resinous herb. So you could take like a lower grade flower and slap all this crap on it, and to people that weren't inspecting the flowers very deeply, if they were buying like say 5-10 pounds at a time, a couple of pounds of these lower grade herb with this treatment that was done to it with these glass balls to make it look like it was highly resinous. But if you looked at it under a scope, you could see that it was pretty clear that it was adulterated with some product. And Arno was telling me that at one point in time, a coffee shop owner came to him and he said, "Hey, can you tell me if this stuff is okay to still sell?" Right? They had identified that it was coated with some crap, and it wasn't about throwing it away. It was about, hey, can I still sell this without, being... They wanted to make sure that they could still sell the product that they had purchased, right?
Those glass balls are used to make paint reflective, like in the streets, They sprinkle that glass on top of the paint after they paint the stripes and stuff like that, and that's what they were doing. But at one point, I seem to remember in Germany, I believe that someone was also putting lead on the cannabis. And if Nick from Red Eye was here, I'd get him to tell a story about when he wanted to figure out what English soap bar was, and he went to the mountaintop in Pakistan and ended up having a story called, I believe it was Crazy Joe and Mr. Big, and he ended up meeting Mr. Big, and they showed him 10 tons of hash, and they showed him how they made it and everything else. And what they were doing was taking a animal feed from Regina from Spain, and they were mixing it in with the resin, like, you know, even at more than a 50-50 mix. And, you know, this guy could tell you how many tons he sold in each country each month, you know, so he was not messing around. But yeah, as far as adulterants, Nick went to the mountaintop and found out exactly what the adulterant was, and it was not good.
Well, I think we can probably agree that any adulterants are not good, right? You know, and really, like I said before, it's like we live in this world where, you know, I think we've kind of been sticking our heads in the sand, willingly. We've been willfully sticking our heads in the sand. It's like this willful ignorance is bliss, you know. By not looking in the flowers, then we can feel pretty comfortable that we're not doing anything wrong to the people that are buying the flowers. But the reality is, if you're a dispensary, and sure, some people are recreational users, but if it is medicinal users, and you know what, even if it is recreational users, people have the right to clean cannabis. You know, it's unacceptable to be putting contaminated flowers on the market. And you know, producers and retailers, they have to have pride. They have to have enough pride to say, no, we're not going to do it. And that's, you know, again, I got to bring it back to you, Etienne. So why you deserve so much credit for what you've done in that Berkeley, in pushing those regulations in Berkeley. You know, you've put the patients and the consumers first. And it's come at the expense of the pocketbook. You know, it's like you said, it costs money to do this.
And you have to have that moral, you know, when you say that, you know, people should, they don't care. They'd rather lie and manipulate and make the margins than necessarily do what's right. And that burns my ass, because I know all these things that fail for me for pesticides are being sold to other patients at other facilities. And I can't go and scream from the mountaintop and stop it. But fortunately, you know, the regulations that are coming down the pike, and the state of California will finally do that for me. But it has not been without a decade of yelling at the top of, you know, inside of my skull.
I hate to say it, but the truth of it is there needs to be a system where if somebody tries to repeatedly sell contaminated cannabis over a 1-year period or even a several-year period, they need to somehow be banned from the industry. I'm serious. This is not permissible.
I agree.
No, it's time, and it's common because as the profit margins are dropping, people are looking for everything they can to save whatever it is they've got, and that's really the crux of the issue. I mean, when you look at even in a legal environment like Colorado, they were getting, you know, caught with Eagle 20 in their facilities because they won't put the practices that would prevent this kind of a situation into play in the first place, and they end up creating elements or environments that are prone to problems, prone to, you know, one spider mite crawls in and ruins their world, and they won't take the precautions that you have to. Like Kenny was posting, you know, this greenhouse he visited, and there was a whole scrub down, and you got to put on a suit and wash up everything and walk in. And I mean, it seems like a pain in the ass, but not as much of a pain in the ass as cutting down your entire crop, cleaning out your entire greenhouse and starting from scratch again, because the whole thing got messed up because one grower walked in with mites on them or spores on them and just infected your whole scene. So there has to be good practices put into play here, or we're going to continually see this stuff. And, you know, my other thing is this, is, I mean, everyone talks about outdoor, but I mean, do we really want flowers that have bird shit on them, or do we want, you know, beneficial insect defecation all over the buds?
I think you can grow cannabis outdoors, just like you grow all the vegetables that you eat covered with bird shit, covered with whatever you're freaking out about. I mean, all the vegetables are grown outdoors in California, or 99% of them, and we manage to live through it. And I think we can grow our cannabis as long as it can fully mature and finish, and it's warm enough in that local environment.
For sure, but I think that cannabis is a different animal. Like the flower is so different from, say, an apple or an
Yeah,
orange.
it's just a weed, dude.
I love it. Tom, you're so quiet over there, and I always love you being with us. You know, is this something that you've seen in outdoor growing being a problem with people contaminating crops?
Oh, definitely. But I think the market is going to be exactly like the organic food market. There's a exponentially growing consumer that wants clean product. And I think the dispensaries that are testing and have ethical procedures should trumpet that in I don't get the East Bay news, and I don't see your advertising at the end, but do you promote all that in your advertising and marketing?
No, I for a time there was, but I mean, now that everybody is and the others are doing that in Berkeley, I mean, it would just be us in Berkeley, like waving our flag about. But consumers can go to Oakland and not, they'll get it tested for THC, but they won't get tested for herbicides or pesticides.
Well, I've learned a huge amount in the 40 minutes that you've been discussing it, and I just think the only 100% way you can be sure is to grow it yourself. And unfortunately, a lot of places are banning outdoor and only allowing indoor. And I went to Davis, the city of Davis, that was considering and passed allowing outdoor. And my basic argument, after hearing a lot of their testimony that they're concerned about pesticides and this testing issue, I said the only way you can be sure is to allow people to grow it outdoors, and there's way less pests than indoors, and they eventually passed it. And I see more and more cities and counties, at least in the Sacramento area, that are starting to consider allowing it.
I hope by us discussing it, that consumers start demanding it, walking into the clubs they purchase from and asking, do you test? And then how do you know it's clean? Because they should be fully informed. People should have a right to know if the product that they're picking up is poisoned or not. I mean, it's a real concern.
Definitely, just like our food. I mean, I grow my own food in the summer and the fall, a little bit in the winter, and buy organic as much as I can. It's the exact same reason.
Yeah, I've been an organic food junkie for quite a while, over 25 years now. And I think eating clean is a good thing. I deserve it. It came out of feeding my plants. I would spend all this money on nutrients, and I started thinking to myself, what's my pH? Why am I not giving myself boost? Why am I not balancing myself? And that's kind of how it switched for me.
And Tom, what kind of tomatoes do you grow? Heirloom tomatoes?
Heirloom, I have like 8 different varieties of the beefsteak size, and then a couple of the cherry, heirloom cherries.
My favorite one is Cherokee Purple, but my wife likes Brandywine a lot.
Yeah, I have the Russian Kroon, and this purple one, I forget the name. They are so different tasting, all the different tomatoes. It's amazing.
It tastes like tomatoes when you was a little boy.
And with variations that are, some are sweet, some are acidic, and it's just like cannabis. There's all different flavors and smells. And the only problem with heirlooms is the skin is so tender that the slightest little bump and it starts to rot, and mildew or mold starts taking hold. A lot of the same problems as cannabis growers.
Well, they do crack really easy, and what you have to do is immediately harvest them and make sauce out of them.
I freeze them.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
James?
Hey, Jim, I think we can hear you.
Me?
Yeah.
Mel Frank? Are you having tea?
Or cereal?
Yes, I mean,
He
my
was born with a spoon up his mouth.
There you go. Well, all right.
Crunching, that's great.
You can actually hear. Hey, welcome on, buddy. How are you?
All right.
Good to hear you.
So
I have a question for the panel, and that is that you know, I'm going back to stuff that I grew like 2-3 years ago, and it still is tasting, and the fragrance is really good. But I wonder if stuff that old is starting to develop any mold or anything. I mean, I don't detect anything at all, but I wonder if it was tested in the lab, if I would start to see any mold. I think it's dry enough where it wouldn't. But you know, I have stuff going back 5-6 years.
You can pack it.
It's still good.
You can pack it in a vacuum, or even when you've got it in a vacuum, then freeze it. Then it won't do that.
Right. I understand that, Sam. I'm just wondering. It looks perfectly good to me. You know, it was dried sufficiently.
Well, I think you'd have a pretty easy, good nose to identify off cannabis, don't you?
If not, you can also send it to a lab. But you got to remember, again, I think it's important to say for the audience that, you know, all those molds and bacteria, like life requires water to grow. That's one of the things about life on this planet.
Exactly. It's dry enough, I think.
He's going to send each one of us 1 ounce of it, and we'll check it out and give you our report.
I'd have to wait a long time for that report, wouldn't I? I mean, an ounce a week.
Good things are worth waiting for.
You know, but along these lines of, you know, how contaminated everything is, you know, when people offer me this stuff that they've grown indoors, you know, the most I'll ever take is like, you know, a small poke, because, you know, they're using Eagle 20, and I'm going to get mycobutanol in there. I don't care how early they used it. I just don't trust the stuff, you know. And I just smoke my own stuff.
Yeah,
and
it's a really good point.
Pretty much my whole life. The one other thing is that one of the only times I ever bought cannabis, actually it was 3 times, was back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when I bought Mexican off the streets of LA, because I just wanted to see what it was like and eventually have it tested. And Jeff from Work Labs did do that for me one time, and was shocked at the amount of pesticides that were in it. And one of them, he just said it was hard to believe how much it had in it. And one of them was, I can't remember the name of it, but it was something that had been banned for about 15 years worldwide. And here they are using it in Mexico. But that is kind of what happens in third worlds, is they get everything that nobody else wants anymore. It gets put onto them. So that's a shame. But all these years that people were smoking stuff from Colombia and Mexico was, you know, loaded with pesticides, probably had molds on a lot of it. And then you had the paraquat also.
Yeah, the paraquat.
You know, I mean, the paraquat, which our good old U.S. government kept spraying on it, even though they know it, you know, does lung damage and everything else. Yeah, so I guess we've survived that, and people will survive what it is now, which I think is much less than what they were getting years ago. Not to excuse it, because it should be absolutely clean. And, you know, these people having trouble in greenhouses and, you know, keeping the molds and powdery mildew from their crops. I mean, they have to, you know, install better systems. I mean, whether they're, you know, all of their intake is UV'd, which would cut down, you know, dramatically how much powdery mildew that's still active would get into the greenhouse. But it seems like there, you know, we have the technology. It's just a matter of implementing it, a matter of the industry learning how to deal with these things. And it's not going to be easy, but I'm sure it will be done, because I think that, like Etienne said, the California is going to impose that on us. You know, they're going to impose that testing, and I think the market will meet it.
Yeah, the market needs it, because the growers are definitely not doing it themselves.
And if we don't do it, who will? And so now out of this, everyone will.
But in the future of regulation, the market will do itself. You really don't even have to regulate this stuff, because after you go and have a greenhouse and you fail multiple times, either you adapt or die, one or the other.
Right.
You know what I mean? You won't be able to operate this way. You won't be able to sell your product. And, you know, what do they say? The definition of insanity is they're repeating the same process and expecting a different result. I mean, yes, it's about environmental controls. And that's what I mean. As Etienne said, they've been doing this for decades in real legitimate agriculture. And, you know, I mean, I have to bite my tongue that yes, in a bucolic world, I want to be able to grow my cannabis in my backyard, all organically, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, to grow it outdoor, field grown, you know, if you're going to the point of distillate, you're going to the point of super refinement, THCA and CBD crystal, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you're going to clean out any kind of contaminants in that process. So, you know, yes, like ketchup, you've got an acceptable allowance of rat feces, so to speak. So, you know, I understand that, but, you know, some of the largest greenhouses in the world, be it Eurofresh Farms, if you go to their website, you'll see they don't exist anymore. And then go back 10 years and look at their history. They failed not once, not twice, but 3 times to control their bugs and disease. And they went bankrupt. They could not control it. And that's a product you can spray any kind of chemical within reason onto and release predator mites and this, that, the other thing. That was their problem. They wanted to be pesticide free, so they were releasing good bugs after bad bugs, et cetera, et cetera. But without a proper labor force, there was no way for them to keep up with that. And so, you know, the crop damage, and that's a crop, again, you can wash off. You can't really wash off cannabis for the consumer. And, you know, that kind of behavior, releasing good bugs after bad bugs, I mean, I got to ask myself at some point, I mean, you know, no disrespect to anybody, but do I want the moltings, the feces, and eggs from one bug, let alone 2, 3, 4, or 5? I mean, you know, if you're really trying to say, okay, well, the rec market can smoke this outdoor field grown, but a real serious medical patient must have this indoor or greenhouse or whatever. I mean, you know, I think all of it should be held to a higher standard. You know, I mean, I tell people, get in your automobile every day and wipe your finger across the side window, not the front window.
Kenny, wait a minute, Kenny. Are you saying that all of your fruits and vegetables and should all be grown in a sanitary manner, free from everything? I mean,
not at all, because you can wash all those things off.
Yeah,
you know,
but I think what I think
bell peppers. I've seen a multitude of crops produced in California, where I come from, and most of them are washed off before market.
Yeah, but even I mean, like you said, if you drive down the 101 and you hit Prunedale and you look over to your right, you see these huge, massive fields of raspberries, and they're all grown under hoop casas. You know, I mean, so if they're doing it for raspberries, I mean, sure, it's a high value crop, but that high value crop is $5 a pound. It's not $1,000 a pound. So, you know, so growing cannabis under sheltered environments.
It's going to be the norm. I mean, there's no, because you can't rinse it off like it's an apple or an orange, which was my point before in the first place. And this is what I think they're running into the problems of, because in some ways you have to treat it like it's a unique agricultural crop, because it is a flower that we're going to eat or smoke.
What do they do with wine grapes? Do they rinse them off to get rid of the bird poop?
Yeah, they do go through a rinsing process after they're dumped from the bins.
They would have to, or it would pick up the taste.
Yeah, but you got to remember, there's also something in producing wine. They do with the white wine grapes. There's something called the noble rot, and that's a pasture disease that we're all used to. It's Botrytis cinereus. Yeah. And so, but in wine production, it actually adds something to the quality of the wine. But I don't think that that's going to be the case in cannabis. And I actually really agree with what Kenny was saying. And I have this debate with people in the cannabis community all the time. I think if you're growing CBD or THC compounds, then field grown is possible. But if you're growing high quality flowers for extracts or for flower consumption, yeah, it will be done in greenhouses, you know, in some form of covered structure. It's just produces that much more of a better product. It's like you said, you don't get bird shit on your pot, right? Like if you got 10 acres of flowers, or even 1 acre of flowers, or even a half acre of flowers, I don't know if maybe it's just an ideal situation or idealism where people haven't really seen the realities of production. But you walk a half acre field of cannabis and you find bird crap all over it.
All over it. Yep. So one other thing I'd like to point out is people in the chat were talking about flushing. You cannot flush microbutanol. I don't care if you've used it through flowering and you think dumping water through your roots for the last 10 days is going to clean that out, you're wrong.
You can.
And a lot of people I don't even think understand what flushing actually does or why it isn't even needed.
It's not just flowering. If you use it in veg, it's still detectable in the flowers.
That's right. That's right. Can I ask you, can Jim and Tom and Sam, did you guys flush at the end of your flowering cycle?
Never, no. Todd,
never.
no, because we grew in the ground. But Todd, who is this guy Michael Butenol, and how come you want to flush him?
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, I never flushed either, but I did develop a routine just from experience, and that is that I stopped feeding nitrogen for probably the last month, really, unless the plant was really showing a lot of yellow leaves. But I wanted the leaves to turn yellow, showing me, or some of the leaves, showing me that, yeah, it was lacking nitrogen. And I also would give it potassium. This whole thing with the phosphorus and potassium, generally, the plants they do need some phosphorus towards the end, but I don't think it's anywhere near what people try to pump into the plant. Phosphorus is pretty obvious as a deficiency. I mean, it's easily recognized, and of course, I give it to it throughout if it's showing a deficiency. But I think the most important thing is not to be giving it nitrogen at the end, and also increase your potassium. Plant takes a lot of potassium at the end. I think it helps in how well it burns and smoke.
I have to.
What I did, but the flushing I never heard of until like the 80s. Sometime in the 80s, people started saying, "Oh, they've got to flush the plant."
Well, people got to remember, cannabis is what they call a hyperaccumulator, right? It's one of those plants that, like, it will pull up more nutrients that it needs out of the soil, and that's an evolutionary advantage in case they were competing against other plants in the environment. So it behooved the plant to, like, absorb these nutrients and store them in case it needed them later on in the life cycle. And so that's what you're doing when you're flushing. You're actually not flushing the nutrients out of the plant. I think there's a big misconception, at least in the community, that that's what you're doing. Like, you don't flush the plant, you flush the soil. Right. And once you deprive the soil of the nutrients, then it forces the plant to use the stores that it has in the plant.
Right, it uses up the sugars, the active sugars. So when I talked to Simon, who owns Serious Seeds, about this, he kind of laughed at the idea of pulling your nutrients in the last week or 10 days of your plants because of the development that occurs in the flower, the oils, the resins, the terpenes. And he said, if you really want to flush your plants, he said, cut them, stick them in a bucket of water, and let them, use up the sugars that are left inside. Because, but he also pointed out to me that he thought that the whole flushing thing came out of people trying to copy the cultivation of tomatoes and other fruits into cannabis, because where it could make the fruit sweeter, if you actually made it use up some of the sugars that were in the plant, it didn't matter with cannabis. And what a lot of people refer to as, the way that a bud ashes or a joint ashes, it's really the curing and not so much the flushing that they're looking for. Because I think a majority of the cannabis people get is not properly cured.
I want to say one thing about this, and that is I've grown the same clone by the thousands every year for 25 years. And the best ones were the ones that yellowed out at the very last couple of weeks. And yeah, they just produce sweeter, better, finer cannabis. I'm not sure if they actually weigh more or anything like that, but the product is superior. And if you have your choice between that and a greener clone of the exact same variety, you'll prefer the one that's very slightly yellowed out.
Well, isn't this what Mel's saying? Is that if you pull the nitrogen in the final 3-4 weeks of a plant, it's going to yellow out.
Yeah, and this is from one single clone that I'm talking about. So, We tried every different variable in the universe, and the ones that would yellow out at the very end were consistently the best tasting and most enjoyable to smoke as herb.
So, I mean, you know, I noticed that 3-4 of you said that you don't flush, and I have to agree with that theory. But I also have to say that all 3 of you and, you know, myself, I don't flush and never did flush, because you understand the composition of the minerals that you're giving the plant and the application, the timing and everything else. And you have the understanding that when you say nitrogen, that you understand that there's ammonium nitrate and nitrate nitrogen, that it doesn't want ammonium nitrate. That's going to cause stretching and, you know, re-veg and a whole bunch of other things. Not re-veg, but, you know, it's going to cause it's going to specifically cater to vegetative growth rather than flowering growth. But even through the flowering cycle, they need a small, minute amount of nitrate nitrogen. But you guys understand that, but you also understand proper burnout, so you don't really over apply fertilizers in your soil composition, so that when you do get to the final stages of your growth, those things are mostly used up. Most of the people that are cultivating now and have adopted, as you said, since the mid 80s, these flushing practices, is because we bought bottles.
We would fertilize in the springtime with long-lasting rock minerals, even things like bone meal, ground bone meal, you know, bone black, all different kinds of things.
Exactly.
Well, remember, we've been taught how to fertilize by nutrient companies, and you know, I remember being in hydro stores and the people behind the counter telling you that every week you need to take your reservoir and dump it down the toilet and mix anew.
Absolutely.
Right, which is insane. And this is, you know, we were talking about before the show started. We were talking about nutrient pollution runoff in the Mississippi Delta and the dead spots that are being created in the Gulf of Mexico from this like excess of nutrients that come flowing in. So you got to remember that it's a nutrients financial benefit to have you taking their salt and dumping it down the toilet every week and making a new batch. You know, you don't need to do that.
Well,
right?
Figure out what the composition is and augment it. But as I was going to point out, even today, you know, we're just getting into the legitimate world where most of the nutrient manufacturers can even put the recipe, so to speak, for how to blend their nutrient for a cannabis plant. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, you went to the grocery store, didn't mention marijuana, you bought a nutrient, you took it home, and hocus pocus, based on your knowledge base, you mixed it accordingly, the way you mixed it. But there was no directions on any of the bottles or anything else. So there was over application. We've all seen those buds that turned into so-called charcoal briquettes or sparkled, and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's mineral buildup. It's phosphates. I mean, this is why you're getting the sparking. You've created a firework, not a marijuana flower. And so don't over apply so you don't have to flush at the end. I mean, I don't believe any other plant growth or life form wants to be deprived of nutrients the last 25% of its life cycle. I believe that's a beneficial stage of life for essential oils, cannabinoids, et cetera, et cetera. So if you don't apply too many chemicals, you don't have to flush.
Well, we should also, let's bring in a little science. I mean, terpene synthases, the central molecule in a terpene synthase is magnesium or manganese. They can operate with both. So if you're stripping your plant, you're reducing the amount of manganese or magnesium in the available to the plant. Your terpene synthases aren't going to be able to work. So you're going to reduce you're going to reduce the efficiency of the synthase. You're going to reduce your essential oil component.
Yeah, I mean, we're stepping into a new phase of multi-hectare greenhouses, and I can't wait to get to the level where you don't buy commercial fertilizers. A man comes up and says, how much zinc, manganese, copper, sulfur, this, that, and the other thing do you want to buy from me this month? And your water guy puts it into your dose meters accordingly, et cetera, and you super refine the real actual needs of a cannabis plant, the science, whether it's bricks meters, whatever methods of analyzation that you're using to create a database. I believe there's going to be some incredible information. I mean, yes, you gave it this, but how much mineral uptake and retention? As you said, I don't know if the yellow plant weighed more, and it's like typically the yellow plant does weigh more than the green plant because it had more mineral uptake and retention. It's a more solid, dense, and thus more flavorful because of the essential oils, accentuated levels of THC, etc. So, you know, if that's the weight on the plants, or addition to the weight of the bud, yes, the yellowing plant's going to weigh more.
That's interesting.
We used to use green sand for potassium, and also kelp.
Are you talking Jersey green sand?
Yes.
Good stuff.
No, for it's garden gold, man.
It's an anti-clumping agent as well.
Without bringing animal feces into your greenhouse.
What? Yes, but you know what though? A thing I'm a little baffled with is like the whole vegan plant food, which I think is, I've been vegetarian, borderline vegan for a long time because I think that it's smart for myself. But
well,
when you
hard
think
to
about how everything breaks down in the soil, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, well, it's hard to understand unless you speak vegetarian. Then it's quite easy.
I think we'll get there. I think it'll be a beautiful mesh of both the vegan aspect. I mean, because bottom line, the world's running out of its supplies of basic NPK. So the phosphate mines of the world, and with the runoff and the misuse, etc. I mean, I agree with Sam that most of the vegetables in California aren't produced in greenhouses, but the ones that are done very, very efficiently. Zero runoff, with a very strategic mindfulness of water conservation, energy conservation, of all of those things.
Unfortunately, what they're not doing is they're not growing the most flavorful tomatoes, because let's say they're growing it in rock wool, which is the big way to grow tomato plants in greenhouses. They're probably using chemical NPK, and they're using modern tomatoes rather than heirloom tomatoes, which fundamentally taste better.
Yeah,
and,
I've seen both organic grown indoor hothouse tomatoes and synthetic fertilizer indoor grown hothouse tomatoes, and I have to agree with you. There's nothing like the tomato you grew in your backyard.
You can't distribute them if they split their skins. You can't. It's a shipping nightmare. It's not even that easy for stores, but farmers markets manage to do it.
Sure.
I guess that's probably, if you don't grow them yourself, the best place to go is to a farmer's market where you can pick up heirloom tomatoes that you really love.
And I'm growing heirloom Italian sweet peppers that are unbelievable. The taste is just unbelievable.
But could you grow those for your whole city?
Sure. I mean, just replace the. Could I? No.
Me neither. and hence, a friend of mine produces tomatoes in Utah. I mean, that's a pretty hostile territory to grow tomatoes, but he obviously does it in greenhouses, and he strategically built his greenhouse next to a power plant so he could, scavenge the water from the combustion that takes place in the power plant. But he also utilizes the hot water to mitigate his heating cost. He also captures and scavenges the CO2 to use in his greenhouse, but also as a strategic advantage of mitigation of shipping and doing the right thing for the environment. Like, I could produce these things cheaper maybe in California, but I could also get them closer to market by producing them here. And he's completely zero waste. He's one of the most positive indoor greenhouse growers that I've ever even heard of. Just amazing.
Does he grow in soil or in rock wool? Do you know?
Cocoa, actually.
What?
Cocoa fiber.
Cocoa. Oh, okay.
But I mean, he's pesticide free. He's got bees pollinating his tomatoes. It's one of the most incredible tomato producers I ever had the pleasure of.
We used to grow 6 different varieties of heirloom, about maybe 250 square feet, or was it 2,500 square feet of tomatoes? About 100 tomato plants, and I also used bumblebees for pollination because in the greenhouse, I got much better tomato set when I used bumblebees.
Yeah, he also feels the same as you. So he also produces heirlooms as well, and a pretty dedicated individual. I looked at a tray of maybe 20 or 30 little dead cuttings that I thought they were, and I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Oh, those are failures." And I said, "From what?" And he said, "Well, they're graftings. That when he produces a tomato plant, he grows 2 tomato plants. He grafts the superior top structure to the superior root structure, and hence makes 1 tomato plant." And he said, in the beginning, I had a 97% failure rate. And he said, now I'm up to about a 3% failure rate. So I thought that was some pretty serious dedication to grow those tomatoes, and a bona fide passion as well. So, yes, he grows makes a strategic decision to grow heirlooms, but he also grows in cocoa fiber, little self-contained singular herbs like, chives and this, that, the other thing. So, when they get to a certain level, he sends them to the market. So you can go into the supermarket, buy it, take it home, keep watering it, and it'll continue to produce for, multiple weeks.
Well, I wonder if we'll get to a point where we're grafting cannabis plants onto better rootstocks.
Absolutely, we will.
Yeah.
I mean, hops, it's been done for many years, right, Ryan?
Yeah, they do it in a whole bunch of
grafted
plants. They do
onto redwood sequoia tree.
Yeah, they also do it to grapes. I think really
Look at all the orchards in the Central Valley. They're all grafts.
yeah.
So Ryan, I'm sure you've heard about the seeds in space, where the Chinese have taken seeds and exposed them to, call it
Gamma rays and everything else.
exactly up in space, and then bring them down, and they produce large fruit. I mean, I heard it's like $500,000 a gram to get your seeds up there.
Really? Can we send our seeds to space?
It's a payload. Yeah, if it was legal, you could. You probably legally send your hemp seeds in China. But they get a lot of diversity out of them.
Wouldn't want to send hemp seeds. You'd want to send the variety you had with the biggest resin heads, so that when it came down and you grew it, the resin heads would be 10 times as big.
How is it modifying the chemistry of the plant? What's happening when they bring it up into what?
It's
why?
causing mutations. I mean, as exposure to radiation.
Yeah, you don't need to be in space to do that. They do that also. That's also, it's funny. It's one of those things. It's not considered GMO, but you can take plants and plant cuttings or seeds and put them close to nuclear reactors or gamma radiation sources and cause mutations, and that's considered organic or classical breeding. It's not considered GMO.
So we could make one that glows in the dark, you're saying?
Well, no, the glow-in-the-dark thing is something called luciferin.
Bioluminescence, right?
Yeah, what they do is they have a gene it's called luciferase or luciferin, and that's there's a really famous picture of a tobacco plant that's growing, and that they transfected a plant with that. That's more that is more GMO. That's considered genetic
yeah. They use it for marker identification and stuff. Sure.
Yeah, well, marker identification is for what's naturally existing in the plant. That's actually, you're taking a gene from the firefly and they put it into the tomato plant.
That's been done with cannabis already too. I had a colleague send me a picture of his leaves where he had managed to get the lucifer gene in there, and it was glowing. I never did follow up with him on that. But that must have been 20 years ago, I think.
Well, that sounds like, I think I know which one you're talking about. It's got like the purple and the pink glow.
No, this was just a leaf where he'd worked in some lab and he managed to do it, and he just was like so proud of himself. He just sent me a picture of it.
I'd be highly skeptical about the veracity of that.
That's nothing. When he made seeds from it, the seeds glowed in the dark too.
So with the fruit fly and the tomato, were they trying to make a flying tomato or what?
The question is if you did that to a cannabis plant and you expressed that luciferin so that it was producing leaf with the plant flower, or it was producing light with the plant flower.
I really have no idea.
They all go hermaphrodite because they're fucking up their own photo period, right?
Yeah, that's true.
No, it would just stay in constant veg.
That might be the original.
Unless
Jack and the
it was
Beanstalk
an
man.
auto variety.
Oh, there you go. You'd have to do it to an auto. Good point.
That is funny. Is there any GMO cannabis that we know of in existence?
Yeah, there's a variety that was, well, it wasn't a commercialized variety, but there's some hemp researchers in Scotland that made a variety that was resistant to botrytis.
It was done in a laboratory. It was not done outdoors, and it's not commercialized.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's around the corner, though, for sure. I mean, I know groups that are already working to produce CRISPR knockouts in plants. So the world of biotechnology is coming to cannabis.
How do we, we're talking about heirloom tomatoes. What about heirloom seeds? It feels like on a lot of levels, there's not a lot of heirloom cannabis and even a reverence for it like there should be.
Yeah, heirloom. Okay, so heirloom is essentially a designation that's given to a seed population that's usually grown within a family or a group of people. And, those seeds are passed down from one gardener to the next. And I think the most often that we hear the word heirloom is with heirloom tomatoes, okay? So heirloom tomatoes are an interesting species that are very different from cannabis, obviously, in the plant, but they're also different in the breeding structure. We talked last week about cannabis and humans being obligate outcrossers and how that creates a whole set of variation in the genome. But tomatoes are different. Tomatoes are what's known as a selfing species. So you can grow, for example, I can take a tomato, Tom could share with me one of his heirloom tomato varieties, just one seed. I could plant the seed, grow out the plant and harvest the tomatoes, and those tomatoes would look exactly like the ones that Tom grew in his garden. And then I could take a seed from the tomato that I grew and do it again and, plant the seed the next year.
Because the tomato has perfect flowers on it with male and female organs in them. So, and you can pollinate within that one flower and it will make successful seeds.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean, I think we can't confuse perfect flowers with selfing species. But the point is that selfing species, they do produce the same type over and over again. You can do single seed descent from a tomato, which is, again, that situation I described where you take one seed, you grow it to a plant, you get the flower, you get the fruit, you harvest the seed from that fruit, and you plant it again. And that type, that tomato type comes back generation after generation after generation, to the point you can do that 20 generations, and the tomatoes still look like the same ones that came in the first generation. Whereas cannabis, because it's an outcrosser, that doesn't happen, right? I mean, there's very few varieties. Like, one good example is a variety from a grower up in Mendocino named Tom Hill, and he has a variety called Deep Chunk, and it's an old Afghan variety. And you plant these things, and they look like clones. They come up, they all look identical. And you open pollinate the variety and plant the seeds again the next year, and again, they come up looking identical to the previous generation. So that's called a true breeding variety, and that would be the closest to what we consider.
Normally, for a true breeding variety to be easily maintained, you need large numbers, like thousands and thousands of males and females. Then it's easier to maintain a constant norm.
But then when you're crossing, this is going to be multiple males crossing multiple females.
Correct. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, but because they're all the same, Todd, they end up reproducing that variety. Essentially, they reproduce the type. Whereas if you were to try to take a hybrid cannabis plant and inbreed it even for a couple of generations, the next generations wouldn't look anything like the parentals, right? And so I think that's really the reason why we don't have heirloom cannabis varieties. We might consider, like, for example, Blue Dream or OG a heritage cultivar, but they're not propagated by seeds. The only way that you can propagate those is from clone, right? Because, again, if you try to propagate it by seed,
the kids don't look like the parents. It's like, you know, it's like Kenny was talking about in Poland's book, Michael Pollan's book, The Botany of Desire. The apples, you know, the apples don't fall. That whole thing about apples never falling far from the tree isn't exactly true genetically, right? Like, if you find a desirable apple plant that produces an apple that's resistant and sweet and has good flavor, and you take the seeds of that plant, that apple, and you plant them and grow a new tree, the fruit from the progeny doesn't look like the fruit from the parent.
Yeah, it's same with feminized seeds. When you feminize, you don't necessarily get what the parent was, even when you self it, which I've done. I use the pollen from the same plant to pollinate itself, and the next generation I may not get anywhere near the terpene profile I had in the first one.
Yeah, if your plant that you're selfing is a hybrid,
exactly,
the hybrid falls apart in the next generations. But for example, if you took like that deep chunk variety and you made feminized seeds from that, the variety replicates itself again the next generation. So it really, the more hybrid nature, the more heterozygous the plant, the less likely that the progeny are going to look like the parent.
Exactly. Right.
One of the good friends of mine owns Territorial Seeds up in Oregon, and they are a big vegetable breeder and grower. They got like a 100-acre farm that they grow a lot of their own seeds. Well, they were the very first Oregon commercial permitted license, and they started a company called New Breed Seeds. It's in Cottage Grove where Territorial Seeds is, and they have a half city block greenhouse right in downtown Cottage Grove where they're breeding. Right now they offer 5 varieties. They're all auto flowering and feminized, and they only wholesale the seeds to retailers in Oregon, but they're doing a booming business. And one of the things they're promoting is interplanting autoflower feminized in with the regular crop for canopy utilization. And they are doing a booming business up in Oregon. Obviously they can't sell out of state, but most of their customers are extract companies that want their product. Check it out. They're probably going to be the seed breeder of Oregon, if they're not already.
Interesting.
If you're ever going north on I-5, they're right in Cottage Grove, which is about 25 miles south of Eugene. And they have a really, both their vegetable company, Territorial Seeds, and this New Breed Seed Company are multi-million-dollar businesses.
It looks like they're just reproducing a couple of Dutch things, but maybe they've got some new ones of their own too. Like they sell a White Widow and they sell an Amnesia.
That's pretty Dutch. Both of those.
Yeah, well, if you look at the terpene profile, it says, you know, Amnesia, dominant terpenes, terpinolene, myrcene, and pinene, which is actually very classic for Amnesia. So it looks like they've just taken some Dutch stuff and they're recreating it there.
Which would make total sense considering what's out there. I was spending a lot of time going through the Phylos Galaxy the last couple of weeks and looking at the comparisons of all the different plants. I mean, look at OG Kush. There's 34 different plants that are all the exact same clone of OG Kush under every different name you can imagine. And I think that it's nice that we can now start seeing this in a centralized location where we can see that, you know, Tahoe OG is just, you know, Josh D's OG Kush cut from 23 years ago. So it really is kind of nice to see these genetics kind of represented, because I mean, I think what is sad is the people that are coming along that don't want to take the time to do any breeding, make any unique varieties. They want to come along, take cuttings that are in production, call it something else, stick it in a package, and, you know, pretend like it's their own work when it's really not. It's not, you know, it's genetics that are really in open source or open general public population where anyone could grow them. And I think it's good, but when you're going to misrepresent what's in the package, I don't think it's a benefit to anybody. So I'm glad things like Phylos are identifying these people and these you know, different cultivars and showing them to be what they really are instead of just hype. Like Khalifa Kush, for instance. Khalifa Kush is just an OG Kush cutting. So whoever is there talking to this rock star is like, hey, I got an idea. We'll just take OG Kush, we'll grow it, we'll put your name on it. It'll be huge. Everybody loves it anyway. And it's a short path to success, but it's a lame path to success.
Come on, the best one out there is Snoop's Dream.
Which is just a Blue Dream cut.
Was Blue Dream.
Well, I've now got the McCormick Kush, so
I think everyone's had that for a long time. I had a lot of people thinking before Josh came public that I had something to do with OG Kush because I had it going back 20 years. I mean, I was growing OG Kush back in '97. So before we called it OG Kush, it was just the Kush. And the reason that I was so interested in it is because it was absolutely nothing like the Kush that I was growing, the Hindu Kush that I was growing back in Amsterdam, that was supposedly from the Hindu Kush Mountains, which was very leafy and low calyxes. And this stuff in comparison, you know, high calyx, low, or I should say bract, low leaf, you know, damn you, Rob, always to this day, damn you, Rob. But yes, and this is what breeding did, but OG Kush wasn't Kush to me. It was just another misnamed plant, if that makes sense. As much as I love OG Kush, just for everybody listening, it's not a Hindu Kush.
Oh, yesterday, speaking to this misnaming things, I noticed on Instagram haze being sold in Vegas, and I called the manager of the grow and I said, "You're growing haze?" And he said to me, "No, actually, it's a Jack." And I said, "Well, why are you calling it haze?" He said, the owners want me to call it haze because that's what will sell.
That's what the customer asked for.
People and confuse the rest of them. That's ridiculous. And so I said, you know, get back to him, tell him that he's already pissed me off, and that they better rethink what they're doing.
Well, this is again. I know I've said this before. This comes back to though. In the future, plants won't be sold based on a fancy name. They'll be sold based on a chemical profile because you can't fake a chemical profile. Right now, I mean, when we say train wreck, we mean a terpinolene dominant plant, you know, a specific terpinolene dominant plant. But here in Vancouver, yesterday I met with someone and she was telling me, oh, I got this great train wreck and we ran it through the lab and, you know, it's high in linalool. Well, it's like, well, real train wreck isn't high in linalool, right? And the reason is we've got this border that runs along the 49th parallel that separates Washington and BC. And that line is pretty good at stopping the plants from coming across, but it's not very good at stopping the names from coming across the border.
Yeah.
Right? So the people know that the name is popular. They want their herb to be worth more. And so they rename whatever they're growing as to this popular name. And, you know, this is nothing new. This started way back with Northern Lights No. 5. I mean, when Northern Lights was popular, everything all of a sudden there was Northern Lights all over the market. It wasn't because everybody had that plant.
Before that, there was Maui Wowie.
Right.
And Kona Gold.
Right. And so that's a brand that's applied to a set of plants. It's not, you know, again, like I said, in the future, that those fancy names are going to be completely irrelevant. It's going to come down to the chemical constituents of the plant or the terpene profiles and the cannabinoid profiles.
Right. And the authenticity of the cannabis is becoming more well known because as we can test things and get this consistency and what consumers are getting, we're able to see who's lying and what's what. Unfortunately, there's a lot of liars in the community, it seems like, you know, like Jim saying people in Vegas just want to call it what they think people want instead of calling it what it is.
Yeah, well, there's some people that are complicit in the lie, but there's some people that are also past a clone that they're told is haze and it's really Jack. And you know, they keep that name because that's what they believe that the plant is. But the reality is they were misinformed. You know,
they bought a clone off the shelf and somebody said it was Jack.
Exactly.
It's going to be interesting to combine that data right there with, like, I'm not sure about other states, but California's been looking at the concept of appellations like wine, saying that, you know, you grew in this geographic location, your District 5 as far as your appellation and stuff. And it'll be interesting as it gets along from that aspect, genetic aspect, many aspects, terpene, cannabinoid, to see 5 different clones grown in 5 different distinct geographic locations, both the terroir aspect or, you know, just environmental aspect, to see what filters out over the next 10 years, to see what kind of geographic location and environmental influences, how they actually impact and influence this plant's production. And
to be part of a cannabis appellation, does it have to be grown outdoors or in a greenhouse? I mean, does it have to
so
have...
far, I haven't seen any definition. They're just looking at just, you know, if it was grown in Mendocino, it must be grown in Mendocino. If it was grown in Napa Valley, this appellation.
If it's grown hydroponically under lights,
there's going to be
I'm not sure that deserves a terroir.
It's only outdoor. I think the SB 64 that merged the medical recreational dictates that it only is outdoor.
You got to remember too, a lot of these
greenhouse could be the same if it used native soil and sunshine. Why wouldn't a greenhouse be acceptable?
I don't know. I didn't make the law, but I'm pretty sure that it says outdoor.
You got to remember a lot of these problems too about the genetics aren't necessarily unique to cannabis. I mean, a bunch of years ago, they did some genetic studies of these old wineries in France. And they realized that, you know, people that were selling these, you know, Bordeaux blends or blends of specific grapes, they actually went and tested the genetics of the grapes, and they realized that the clones that they thought were a specific variety were actually another variety. You know, and that's probably what happened is somebody sold the vineyard at one point in time, and they said, yeah, these 6 acres are Pinot Noir. But, you know, it turned out that it was a different grape altogether.
Yeah, more so than the denote terroir or anything else. I mean, you know, it's more for strategic market advantage. If you don't grow your grapes in and make your champagne in the Champagne region of France legally, you can only call it sparkling wine. So more so than terroir influence, it was a marketing strategy, so to speak.
But all grapes are grown under the sun and not in greenhouses.
No, sure.
Cannabis can be grown in a greenhouse, and it could absolutely have unique properties because of that soil. And
yeah, the terroir influence, I completely understand. And that's what I'm trying to explain is mostly what they're trying to prevent is some guy producing weed in a dirty little warehouse in Los Angeles trying to sell it as grown in Humboldt, organic outdoor, you know?
Yeah.
I think
well, again, I think that the terroir,
the reason for the denote of the appellation, you know, you must state where it comes from.
Yeah, I think terroir in grapes is something that's measurable, and I don't know that anybody has actually shown any chemical differences imparted by terroir in cannabis yet. So, I mean, I think it's probably, you know, we're trying to put on a set of characteristics again to commercialize a given brand, like Kenny's saying, rather than actually measure something that's real. Whereas in wine, there actually is, you know, a difference between like a left bank or a right bank Beaujolais grown in
soil.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to see a lot of this happening with cannabis as people start understanding the uptake of nutrients in the plants they're growing. They're not going to want to waste money buying nutrients that the plants aren't utilizing, which is what they're doing now. And they're going to stop listening to the plant, you know, professionals at the garden stores that have done nothing much more than work at the garden shop and maybe some restaurants in their whole career and don't know what they're talking about. I mean, because it's funny when you start talking to people who actually grow cannabis, it's amazing to me how they're so different from what the people that work at the grow shops who think you have to do to grow cannabis are saying. You know, and I started seeing this when I was hanging around at Positronics in Amsterdam over 25 years ago, when we were just hanging out and sharing stories as growers in an unparanoid space. And that was one of the first times, I mean, shit, 5-6 years before there was overgrow on the internet, we had Positronics and we'd all sit there comparing notes. That was kind of the first forum I saw where you could actually do that without fear. So this is going to, I think, happen more and more now that we're having open discussion. And as we have open discussion, I think a lot of the misconceptions of the past are going to be shed, and a lot of the real useful technologies are going to be applied. So I have a lot of optimism that cannabis is going to get better and better, and cultivation practices are also going to get better and better as people better understand what it is they're doing and what it is they're working with.
I agree.
It's inevitable. It became a real live entity, a real commercial industry at this point. You must conserve nutrients. You must look at your bottom line. Why give nutrients to a plant that it's not going to utilize or doesn't want, or waste water, or that is going to be some of the strategic advantages. I seen a Canadian company released information last week that they had taken their cost of production from $1.36 a gram to $1.11 a gram. I mean, those things are becoming very, very, very paramount as the cost of as the cost of the goods sold becomes lower and lower and lower and lower.
It's going to have to happen that way, though. I mean, the price is going to drop, and so will the profit margins. And as the profit margins drops, only the most efficient are going to survive. Everyone that's wasteful is going to go out of business.
Or everybody bug and disease infected.
Right. Yeah, but it's not only about dollars and cents. I mean, it's about quality too. That company that you're talking about is Afria. They're calling themselves the low-cost producer, and they grow everything in massive bulk in greenhouses. But I think the market would show that their flowers are not the most highly sought in the marketplace.
Yeah, no.
Right. You're talking commercial. Some of the best flowers I've ever tasted are small home growers that either grow for their personal use or for friends. Just like home brewers and home winemakers, some of the best alcohol I've ever tasted. Actually, even hard liquor. I play with softball with somebody that makes this fruit brandy that's tastes like whiskey. It's so good. It's not sweet. It's dry. So the home growers are going to be adding to the quality also.
But I've always felt that quality and quantity do not often go hand in hand. And while there are people like Sam that can produce large quantities of high quality pot, there are not a lot of people that can pull this off. I mean, by the time they're done trimming it, they've ruined it because they've over dried it and steamed off most of the terpenes in a lot of their cases. So a lot of the most damaging elements of cannabis, in my opinion, happens after harvest.
I've seen more as a dispensary. I've seen more cannabis ruined from here on than anything.
Yep, and then storage. People don't understand how to store cannabis. My friend just showed me some.
Or just curing properly, slowly curing your crystals so that they're actually do everything proper. People need to learn, and that was the problem with a lot of the books. A lot of the books didn't have proper curing, how to actually deal with the post.
No, most of the books did not actually talk about that really, really well. And that's why I think a lot of people misunderstand what's happening when they improperly cure something with thinking that it wasn't flushed properly. And when reality is that you can flush all you want, and if you don't cure it properly, it's still going to burn like shit. But if you actually, you could feed all the way through properly and then cure it properly, and you're going to get a great smoke. Full of flavors, full of terpenes, richer than it would have been if you had starved it in its last couple or few weeks of development, for sure.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize the color of the ash is really related more to the temperature at which the cannabis burns than how it was cured or how it was flushed, right? If something burns hot, the ash is white. If something burns very cool, then it doesn't really burn fully. So you end up with this black kind of chunky ash. And sure, it might be factors related to over fertilization or curing that create it, but you got to remember that it is just the physics of the temperature of the burn that creates the color of the ash.
Well, if there's still moisture present or it wasn't properly dried and cured, then you're going to get this nastier ash because of the way that it's combusting.
If you have over fertilization, you got a buildup of nutrients, is what he's saying. So if it turns ashy, you've got massive amount of minerals built up, and you're not going to melt those.
But you don't really, do you? I mean, I thought that what you have in the flowers is sugars.
Mineral uptake and retention. What do you think the actual?
Where does the plant retain the nutrients, Ryan, or anyone?
And its leaves and everything else. As stores it as.
Yeah, they're stored as starches typically.
Carbon, starches, oil, essential oils, cannabinoids, and terpenoids.
Yeah, I wouldn't consider the cannabinoids and the terpenoids a store of energy per se. I think that's probably more starches. I mean, that's all. Mm-hmm. But yeah, everything the plant takes up, it can store, right? Which is again why why they use hemp as a bioremediator, right? Like cannabis can take up its heavy metals from the soil.
Well, they were using it to actually clean where they had Chernobyl. They were planting hemp to pull up the radiation from the ground. So clearly it pulls up what it's growing in. Just when it comes to the minerals and stuff, I don't know. I always thought that people were so far off with the way they looked at the way the plant stored the sugars and the way it utilized them. And
there was a great study in the mid-90s that showed the heavy metal factory in Poland where they actually planted hemp, and it pulled all the heavy metals out of the soil, and then began the debate about, okay, so now that this hemp it has pulled all these impurities out of the ground, now what can you do with it? I think the same thing is being debated currently in Japan right now, because they're looking at, I'm hearing of planting hemp to also pull some of that radiation out of around Fukushima. But then the debate is, what then you do with this hemp? I turned down that Ukrainian hemp that was grown in Russia, because, well, back then when it was Russia, because it was so cheap and I needed access to hemp. And I sent somebody literally over there with a rad meter, and it fucking tacked high. And was like, whoa, we can't touch that. But the reality is it is beneficial. It does pull these things out. But then what can we do with this once it's done? Now you have radioactive hemp. Now you have heavy metal hemp. There's not really much you can do with that hemp, but it does help that soil.
But if you just give it a bunch of water, it'll flush all that stuff, right?
That heavy metal thing also happened, with Project CBD. O'Shaughnessy's published that study that showed that the stuff coming from Eastern Europe was loaded with heavy metals, and warned about using that CBD from there.
I had not seen that. I didn't realize that, but that totally makes a lot of sense if it's pulling it out and they're utilizing it.
It was about 4 or 5 years ago that they published that. Very interesting.
More and more, it's buyer beware.
Yeah, well, I think even a lot of these claims of the bioremediation. I mean, there's more science that needs to be done on a lot of this stuff. I mean, they did some studies where they were looking at hemp's ability to pull copper out of the soil, and copper and cadmium, and it was able to pull it up out of the soil, but it actually stored it in the roots of the plant. It didn't translocate it even up into the above ground tissues of the plant. So it's like I think we really are coming into a whole time where a lot of these beliefs that we have about cannabis and even terroir and flushing and everything, bioremediation, that a lot of this stuff still needs to be validated with science.
Absolutely, 100%. Completely agree.
So that's going to be part of the beauty of of living in this future of cannabis as a real industry. We're going to learn so much.
We are going to learn so much. I think that's what I find so exciting about this. Is
one thing is obvious: either via GMO with luminescence or radioactive hemp. Hemp in the future will glow.
That we've determined. Right. Even our buds will.
Fabric, right? It'll just have it glowing. Glow shirts.
It'll be easy to find in a dock drawer.
Right.
Well, everybody, I want to thank you guys for joining us today. Kenny has to go. He's got an appointment, as does Tom. And, Mel, thank you for keep trying and getting on. I really appreciate your perseverance in that.
Thank you.
Well, it's really an honor to have all you guys together and to talk to you. And Ryan, thanks for coming on again this week. I hope you do it more often. You're just a great source of information, and I love how you present yourself.
Thanks. Pleasure to be hanging with you guys as always.
Always nice. And Etienne, thank you very much. Sam, thanks for staying up and doing this one with us. Talking to Rob. Rob said he'll start doing it as soon as he gets in Wi-Fi range. So we'll start seeing Rob on the show pretty soon too.
Okay.
Excellent.
Well, thank you guys, everyone. So I'm going to say goodbye for now, and we'll see you next Saturday on Talking Cannabis.
Thank you, everybody. It was fantastic.